Beneath the veil of American history, there are stories that were never meant to see the light. Stories so tangled in secrecy that entire families disappeared into silence, their names whispered only in the corners of abandoned towns. Tonight you will hear one of those stories, a story of a mother and her children. But in this house, children did not belong to fathers, they belonged to everyone, brothers, sons, uncles, and the line between family and possession shattered until nothing human remained. This is not a tale of fiction, nor is it some distant legend. It happened here, in the dirt of America, where poverty and isolation built cages around bloodlines, and inside those cages, families grew closer in ways they were never meant to. What begins as survival slowly curdles into something unholy, a legacy of inbreeding so profound it erased the very meaning of kinship. Imagine a child born into such a home. She is not seen as a daughter, but as a resource. Her value is not her smile or her dreams, but her ability to provide more children, children who carry the same last name, the same blood, the same deformities. She learns, at an age too young to name, that her womb belongs not to her, but to her family. Her brothers take turns where suitors should have stood. Her uncles step in where strangers never dared, and when her children are born, no one can tell whether they are her sons, her nephews, or both. Generations stack upon one another like rotting beams in a collapsing house. Each child weaker, sicker, more broken than the last. Diseases that should have died centuries ago crawl through their blood like shadows that never leave. Yet the cycle does not stop, because in these remote forgotten hollows of America, shame has no voice. No outsiders are allowed in, and the few who come too close rarely speak of what they've seen. The family we will speak of tonight became infamous not just because of what they did behind closed doors, but because those doors were eventually forced open. Neighbors began to notice children who could not speak, who could only grunt like animals, faces that looked eerily alike, twisted by years of inbreeding, and at the center of it all, one mother, who was not just a mother, but the sister, the aunt, and the grandmother of her own children. A woman who bore generation after generation of children that were never given a chance to escape. And still, this story is not hers alone, because she was born into a nightmare crafted by those before her, and the soil beneath her feet holds more secrets than even she could tell. When we trace the origins of this tragedy, we do not find a single moment of corruption, but a slow, creeping rot passed down through the years. The beginning lies in isolation, geographic, social, and spiritual. These were families who lived on the margins of society, tucked away in forgotten hollows where roads turned to mud and outsiders never stayed long. Poverty was not just an obstacle, it was the air they breathed. Education rarely entered these walls, and with each generation, ignorance became tradition. When resources vanish, people cling to what is near, and what was near, in these families, was blood. The daughter who should have been promised a new life was instead promised back to the house. The brother who should have left to build his own home found his life tethered to his sister's. It was not spoken of in the way we think of choices. It was assumed, expected, demanded. The family became a closed loop, feeding on itself, blind to the decay it created. Over time, the children born of such unions carried the evidence in their bodies. Narrow chests, sunken eyes, faces shaped too similarly to distinguish one from another. Some were born unable to walk, others unable to speak. Many never lived long enough to see adulthood, their fragile forms collapsing under the weight of their inheritance. But even death could not break the cycle. The living clung to one another, not out of love, but out of necessity, out of fear of a world that had long abandoned them. And so the mother at the heart of this story was born into silence. She was a child who never asked to be chosen, but was chosen all the same, by brothers, by uncles, by a legacy that had decided her fate before she took her first breath. To speak against it was impossible. To dream of escape was dangerous, because when an entire family shares the same crime, they do not forgive those who seek to betray it. The tragedy is not only in what was done, but in how ordinary it seemed within those walls. For the girl who would one day become the mother of her brother's children, there was no moment of decision. Her first steps into womanhood were shadowed by the hands of her own bloodline, and by the time her womb carried life, it was already too late. For her children, and for every generation that followed. The house itself became a prison without bars, a place where history repeated with the stubborn cruelty of a curse. Within those rooms, a mother birthed children who were more than children. They were her brother's sons, her uncle's daughters, and, in time, her own grandchildren. The lines blurred until the family tree was no longer a tree at all, but a tangled knot of branches feeding into themselves. Whispers from the few outsiders who dared to approach spoke of children who could barely form words, whose mouths hung open as if language had never been taught to them. Some crawled on all fours, their bodies twisted by genetic collapse. Others sat in silence for hours, eyes wide, movements strange, like beings caught between human and animal. What most would call deformities, the family treated as common, just another mark of their blood, another symptom of what could never be undone. And at the heart of it all was the mother, a woman who should have been a victim, but who became the unwilling architect of her family's continuation. She birthed not one, but many children, each a mirror reflecting the sins of their fathers, her own flesh and blood. To neighbors, she was both feared and pitied, a woman broken into obedience, unable to escape, but too complicit to be saved. She carried within her the curse of her lineage, and each child she bore was another nail sealing the coffin of her family's future. The horror of this story is not only in the grotesque results of inbreeding, but in the normalization of it. For those inside the house, this was life as it had always been. To them, there was nothing shocking about a child who could not speak, nothing unusual about a boy who looked more like his uncle than his father, because they were the same man. This silence was their survival. Exposure meant judgment. Exposure meant removal, and so they closed ranks, protecting their own, while the world outside continued to forget they even existed. But forgotten things have a way of clawing their way back into memory, and as time passed, the family's secret grew too large, too grotesque to remain hidden. The children who grunted, the faces that seemed sculpted from the same broken mold, these would become their undoing. What the family had guarded for generations was about to be dragged into the light. The breaking of silence began not with investigators or officials, but with whispers that traveled through the hills. Travelers spoke of a family whose children did not speak like others, who communicated through grunts and guttural sounds, their words trapped somewhere between instinct and language. Neighbors, though scarce and often afraid, could not ignore the strange cries that echoed from that house, nor the eerie sameness of the faces that peered from its windows. What had been hidden by geography could no longer remain invisible when the evidence was walking, crawling, and crying in plain sight. Eventually, word reached those in power, sheriffs, social workers, journalists. What they found when they arrived was almost too surreal to believe. Grown men who could not form sentences, children whose bodies bore the unmistakable marks of collapsed genetics, sloping foreheads, misshapen jaws, twisted limbs. The home itself reeked of decay, its walls thin with neglect, its air heavy with secrets. And at the center of it all, the mother, her face lined not only with age, but with the exhaustion of bearing lives that were never hers to choose. Some of the visitors could not even step inside, shaken by the sounds and sights that greeted them. They described children squatting in corners, grunting to one another, their movements animalistic, their stares vacant yet piercing. These were not monsters by choice, but by birth, by the crushing weight of a family legacy that never allowed them to be children at all. The tragedy was not in their existence, but in the fact that they were doomed to it. When news of this family broke beyond the hills, it struck the public like a revelation. How could such a thing exist in modern America, a land of supposed progress and prosperity? The answer was as simple as it was horrifying: isolation, forgotten people in forgotten places, left to their own devices until survival twisted into something unrecognizable. The family's story became a spectacle, their suffering packaged as curiosity, their tragedy broadcast as horror. And yet, behind every sensational headline was a truth no one wanted to face. This was not an accident. It was the product of generations of silence, shame, and neglect. The mother herself rarely spoke to outsiders, and when she did, her words were fragmented, evasive, wrapped in fear. For her, the damage was already carved into her bloodline, and nothing, no investigation, no removal, no exposure, could undo it. She had become both prisoner and warden, birthing children who would inherit only her suffering. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because what comes next is not just the story of a family. It is the reflection of what happens when shame festers in silence, when society looks away, and when bloodlines are consumed by themselves. As the investigation deepened, the mother's children were studied not only by neighbors and officials, but by scientists, psychologists, and journalists desperate to explain what they were seeing. Some of the children could not recognize themselves in mirrors. Others rocked back and forth for hours, humming strange tones as though caught in a trance. A few displayed bursts of anger, uncontrollable and sudden, as though their fractured minds could not contain the weight of existence. These behaviors were catalogued, dissected, and published for the world to see, transforming living, breathing humans into grotesque exhibits of genetic collapse. Yet behind those reports was a far darker truth. The mother, the central figure of this tragedy, carried a secret heavier than any deformity. Each time she birthed a child, she knew the father was no stranger. It was her own kin, sometimes a brother, sometimes an uncle, sometimes a child she had once raised, now grown enough to claim her again. She bore it all in silence because what choice did she have? In a family where every man saw her as property and every woman had been raised for the same fate, resistance was unthinkable. The cycle consumed her before she even knew it existed. And what of her children? Some lived long enough to reproduce themselves, ensuring the curse would continue. Others died before they could speak their first words, their fragile forms too broken to endure. Those who survived carried not only physical scars but the haunting awareness of what they were. For many, life was little more than survival, hidden away, mocked when discovered, too broken to foam. You'll join the world outside, yet too human to ever be forgotten. The story of this family is not simply one of biology gone wrong. It is a story of what happens when poverty, isolation, and silence converge to erase humanity itself. This was not just a mother and her children. It was a dynasty of suffering, carved into flesh and bone, repeated again and again, until even their names dissolved into legend. So I ask you now, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run, knowing escape meant exile and betrayal? Or would you have stayed, chained to the same curse that defined your family for generations? Tell me in the comments. Because some questions have no clean answers, and this one may haunt you long after this story ends. As the years passed, the family's story was pulled apart by outsiders who wanted to understand, to explain, perhaps even to justify what they had seen. But the truth was simpler than the reports, harsher than the headlines. This was not just inbreeding, it was captivity of the spirit. The mother had been born into a cycle that erased choice long before she ever drew breath. She did not fall in love, she did not marry, she did not choose. Her body was chosen for her again and again, until the difference between victim and participant blurred into survival. Those who encountered her children described them as eerie reflections of one another, as though they had all been carved from the same mold. Their speech was broken, their gestures primal, but their eyes, those wide, searching eyes, betrayed the tragedy within. They were aware enough to feel their own difference, but powerless to change it. And that awareness may have been the cruelest inheritance of all. To live in the shadow of what you are, to know that the world sees you as something less than human, and yet to feel fully human on the inside, that is a torment no child should endure. The mother herself faded into obscurity as the story spread beyond her. To some she was a monster, the woman who birthed generations of deformity. To others, she was a victim, crushed under a history of silence and submission. The truth lies somewhere in between. She was a woman caught in the grip of a curse she did not cast, but one she unwillingly carried forward. Every birth was a reminder that her womb was not her own, but a vessel for the sins of her family. The community around her, when pressed, spoke only in half-whispers. Some claimed they had long suspected something was wrong, that they had heard strange cries or seen children skulking in the woods. Others denied knowledge, as if to distance themselves from the shame. Booze, whether in complicity or ignorance, they had all played their part in keeping the family's secret alive. For decades, the silence of the hills protected the family more effectively than any locked door. And so, when the story finally reached the outside world, it arrived not as a cry for help, but as a grotesque revelation. A mother whose children were her nephews, a grandmother whose grandchildren were also her sons, a family so entangled in itself that it no longer knew where one generation ended and another began. The final tragedy of this story is not simply the grotesque family tree, nor the twisted bloodlines that spiraled into deformity and silence. The true horror is what it reveals about us, about a nation that allowed entire families to vanish into the cracks, to rot unseen, until their existence became something unrecognizable. These people were not ghosts, not monsters. They were human beings, abandoned by the world that claimed to value progress and civilization. The mother at the center of it all lived and died in that same shadow. Her children, those who survived, carried her legacy like a scar carved into their very being. Some lived out their days in obscurity, trapped in the same cycle of dependence and silence. Others were absorbed into institutions, studied like artifacts, their names stripped away and replaced by labels. Subject, case, example. None of them ever truly escaped. The curse of their bloodline followed them everywhere. What remains today is not the family itself, but the echo of their story. It lingers in documentaries, in whispered retellings, in the hushed tones of those who stumble across their photographs. Faces that look eerily alike, expressions caught between innocence and something unspeakable. Their existence has become a cautionary tale, a grotesque footnote in the larger history of America's forgotten people. Yet beneath the horror lies something deeper, something more uncomfortable, the recognition that this was not an accident of nature, but a consequence of human neglect. Isolation breeds silence. Silence breeds secrets, and secrets, when left to fester long enough, can consume entire generations. The mother who bore her brother's children was not the beginning of this story. She was merely another link in a chain that stretched back decades, perhaps longer, forged from poverty, ignorance, and fear. The tragedy is not hers alone. It belongs to everyone who looked away. So tonight, as you leave this story behind, remember what you have seen. Not simply a family broken by inbreeding, but a legacy of silence that devoured them from within. Remember that these stories are not buried as deeply as we would like to believe, and ask yourself, how many more families live forgotten in the margins, their secrets waiting in the dark, their tragedies growing in silence, until one day they too are dragged into the light. Because in the end, history is not only about the past. Sometimes it is the shadow that waits for us in the present, reminding us that some curses are never truly broken,